He lived in such a way that every smile could cost him his life. Surrounded by enemies, he sat at the same table, raised his glass, and listened to their confidential confessions while secretly planning moves that would change history. The name of this man is Nikolai Kuznetsov, and his fate became one of the most astonishing in the world of intelligence. How did a boy from a remote Ural village transform into an officer accepted as one of their own, even by the most vigilant generals? His disguise was so convincing that he was trusted with secrets upon which thousands of lives depended. Hidden in his file are mysteries that remained unspoken for decades. Strange operations, unexpected coincidences, transformations at the edge of possibility, all of this will be revealed to you. But the most shocking details await in the finale, and they will force you to look differently at where truth ends and legend begins. Don't forget to like, leave a comment, and subscribe. You are not here by accident. In the summer of 1911, in the remote village of Zyryanka in Perm Governorate, a boy was born who would one day redefine the art of deception. Nikolai Ivanovich Kuznetsov grew up in a modest family, his father a forest guard, his mother a homemaker. Surrounded by the endless Ural forests, he learned silence, patience, and the power of observation. From childhood, Nikolai displayed a remarkable memory. He could repeat entire conversations weeks later, word for word. Teachers were astonished, but even more striking was his habit of studying people. He copied gestures, voices, and habits until he could impersonate them flawlessly. Villagers joked he was a chameleon, yet his transformations carried an uncanny realism. With priests, he was solemn, with officials confident, with workers plain-spoken, always blending seamlessly into the crowd. By adolescence, his mimicry became a survival skill. He altered his accent and posture so naturally that it seemed he had no single identity, only the ability to become anyone. His gift for languages followed the same path. Listening to passing German traders, he absorbed their speech until he could converse with a flawless accent. When asked where he had studied, he would simply smile. This unusual childhood, marked by sharp memory and extraordinary adaptability, forged the foundation for a destiny few could imagine: the creation of one of the most brilliant legends in the history of espionage. The transition from village youth to Soviet intelligence operative began with a stroke of circumstance that seemed almost predetermined. In 1934, at age 23, Nikolai found himself working as a technical instructor in Sverdlovsk, now Ekaterinburg. His exceptional linguistic abilities and uncanny talent for mimicry had already attracted attention from local party officials. But it was his psychological profile that truly interested the recruiters who eventually approached him. The NKVD, predecessor to the KGB, was always seeking individuals with unusual capabilities. They needed people who could disappear into enemy territory, assume false identities, and maintain those personas under extreme pressure. Traditional training could teach someone to speak a foreign language or forge documents, but what they needed was something rarer: someone who could authentically become another person. In Nikolai Kuznetsov, they found exactly what they were looking for. Initial training took place in Moscow, where Kuznetsov was introduced to the dark arts of intelligence work. He learned cryptography, weapons handling, and interrogation techniques. But these were secondary skills. His primary talent required no teaching. It only needed refinement. Under the guidance of experienced handlers, he practiced assuming different identities for weeks at a time. He would live as a German businessman, thinking in German, dreaming in German, until even his instructors began to feel unsettled by the completeness of his transformation. The psychological demands of this training were enormous. To become someone else authentically, Kuznetsov had to suppress his own personality so thoroughly that it virtually disappeared. His handlers worried about the long-term effects of such deep identity manipulation. Some trainees who attempted similar transformations suffered what modern psychology might recognize as dissociative disorders. They lost track of their original selves, became confused about their real identities, or suffered complete psychological breakdowns. But Kuznetsov seemed to possess an unusual mental resilience. He could slip in and out of different personas without apparent strain. When debriefed after weeks of living as a German officer, he would return to his Russian identity as easily as changing clothes. This ability both impressed and concerned his superiors. They had created the perfect deep-cover agent, but they also wondered what kind of person could compartmentalize their identity so completely. By 1940, Kuznetsov was ready for field operations. The war that would soon engulf Europe would provide the perfect testing ground for his extraordinary abilities. Creating Paul Wilhelm Sebert required more than simply inventing a name and printing false documents. The identity had to be so detailed, so thoroughly researched, that it could withstand scrutiny from German officers who might have grown up in the same regions Sebert claimed as home. Every aspect of the persona was carefully crafted by intelligence specialists who understood that a single incorrect detail could prove fatal. The backstory began with Sebert's supposed birth in 1913 in Romania to ethnic German parents. This detail was crucial because it explained any slight variations in his German accent or unfamiliarity with specific German regional customs. Ethnic Germans from Romania often had subtle differences in speech patterns, making them distinct from Reich Germans while still being accepted within Nazi military circles. The legend positioned Sebert as someone who had grown up speaking German at home but Romanian in school, accounting for any linguistic peculiarities observers might notice. Professional history required equal attention to detail. Paul Sebert had allegedly attended business school in Bucharest before joining the Romanian military as a young officer. When Germany became allied with Romania, he transferred to German service, showing the kind of opportunistic loyalty that was common among ethnic Germans from Eastern Europe. His military record indicated competent but unremarkable service, the sort of background that would attract neither special attention nor suspicion. Physical preparation was equally important. Kuznetsov had to not only look German, but carry himself like a German officer. This meant learning the subtle differences in posture, gait, and gesture that distinguished German military bearing from Soviet training. He practiced for hours in front of mirrors, adjusting the angle of his shoulders, the rhythm of his walk, the way he held his hands when speaking. German officers had a particular way of wearing their uniforms, a specific manner of saluting, even characteristic ways of lighting cigarettes or drinking coffee. The most challenging aspect was psychological preparation. Kuznetsov had to become Paul Sebert so completely that he would react instinctively as a German officer, even under extreme stress. This meant not only thinking in German, but developing the emotional responses, prejudices, and assumptions that a real German officer would possess. He studied Nazi ideology not to believe it, but to understand how someone who did believe it would think and react in various situations. By late 1942, Paul Wilhelm Sebert existed as completely as any real person. His identity was supported by authentic-looking documents, corroborated by carefully planted records, and embodied by a man who had made the character his own. The stage was set for one of the most audacious intelligence operations of the Second World War. In October 1942, Paul Sebert made his debut in Nazi-occupied Rivne, the administrative capital of Reich's Commissariat, Ukraine. The man who stepped off the train that autumn day was no longer Nikolai Kuznetsov in any observable way. He carried himself with the confident swagger of a German officer, spoke fluent German with the proper Romanian accent, and possessed documents identifying him as a liaison officer working with German security forces. His cover story was perfectly mundane, which made it perfect. Sebert was supposedly investigating industrial sabotage and coordinating security measures for important facilities. This role gave him legitimate reasons to travel throughout the region, meet with various officials, and ask detailed questions about military installations and administrative procedures. More importantly, it positioned him as someone other German officers would want to cultivate as a useful contact. The early weeks tested every aspect of his preparation. German officers invited him to social gatherings where conversation flowed freely over beer and schnapps. These informal meetings were far more dangerous than any formal interrogation might have been. When men relax and drink together, they share personal memories, make references to shared experiences, and expect their companions to respond with similar intimacy. A single wrong response, a misunderstood reference, or an inappropriate reaction could expose him instantly. Kuznetsov navigated these social minefields with remarkable skill. When officers discussed their experiences in specific battles, he would listen carefully and respond with general comments about the challenges of warfare. When they reminisced about life in Germany, he would deflect to his supposed Romanian background, expressing envy for their experiences while explaining his own different upbringing. He became expert at asking questions that encouraged others to talk about themselves, reducing the need for him to provide detailed personal information. His first intelligence coup came within weeks of his arrival. During a casual dinner conversation with Wehrmacht logistics officers, he learned about planned troop movements that would leave certain defensive positions temporarily vulnerable. This information, carefully encoded and transmitted through underground channels, allowed Soviet forces to launch successful raids on previously impregnable targets. The intelligence was so precise and valuable that it immediately established Sebert's credibility within German military circles. But perhaps more important than any specific information was what these early successes revealed about Kuznetsov's psychological state. Living as Paul Sebert 24 hours a day, never able to relax his guard, constantly calculating every word and gesture, would have broken most people within weeks. Yet Kuznetsov seemed to thrive under the pressure. His handlers began to suspect they had created not just a successful spy, but something unprecedented. A man who might actually prefer living as someone else, rather than being himself. The intelligence flowing from Paul Sebert's operations began revolutionizing Soviet understanding of German plans and capabilities in occupied Ukraine. By early 1943, Kuznetsov had established himself as an essential figure in the social and professional networks of Nazi occupation forces. German officers sought his company, valued his opinions, and most critically, trusted him with information they would never have shared with anyone they suspected of disloyalty. His most significant intelligence breakthrough came through patient cultivation of relationships with German staff officers responsible for strategic planning. These men worked directly with information from Berlin, handling communications about troop dispositions, supply requirements, and operational objectives. Through careful questioning spread across multiple conversations, Kuznetsov pieced together detailed intelligence about German defensive preparations along the entire Ukrainian front. The information he gathered went far beyond simple troop numbers. He learned about new defensive techniques being implemented, morale problems among German units, supply shortages affecting combat effectiveness, and most importantly, strategic disagreements between different levels of German command. This intelligence proved invaluable for Soviet military planners who were preparing major offensive operations. One particular coup demonstrated both his growing influence and the extraordinary risks of his position. Through his supposed security work, Kuznetsov gained access to communications about German plans for dealing with partisan activities. He learned not only about upcoming anti-partisan operations, but also about collaborators who were providing intelligence to German forces. This information allowed Soviet handlers to neutralize double agents while protecting legitimate resistance networks. But intelligence gathering was only part of his mission. Kuznetsov was also tasked with what intelligence services euphemistically call direct action, operations designed to eliminate key enemy personnel. These assignments required him to identify high-value targets, study their routines and security arrangements, and create opportunities for what would appear to be accidents or attacks by unknown assailants. His first target was a German administrative official responsible for coordinating forced labor programs. The man had been instrumental in organizing the deportation of Ukrainian civilians to work in German factories, a program that amounted to modern slavery. Kuznetsov spent weeks studying the official's habits, learning his routes between home and office, identifying moments of vulnerability. The elimination was carried out with clinical precision, appearing to be the work of Ukrainian partisans rather than a calculated intelligence operation. Each successful operation enhanced Paul Sebert's reputation among German authorities while advancing Soviet strategic objectives. But they also deepened Kuznetsov's psychological isolation. He was achieving remarkable success by befriending people he would later kill, earning trust he was systematically betraying, and living a life of complete deception. The psychological toll of such profound duplicity would challenge any human being's mental stability. The line between intelligence gathering and direct action began to blur as Kuznetsov's operations evolved into something approaching a one-man campaign of psychological warfare against Nazi occupation forces. By mid-1943, a series of mysterious deaths had created an atmosphere of paranoia among German officials throughout the region. High-ranking officers were dying under circumstances that seemed random, but were actually the result of careful planning and precise execution. The targets were carefully selected based on both their strategic importance and the psychological impact their deaths would create. German officials who had been most effective in suppressing resistance activities, organizing deportations, or maintaining civilian compliance suddenly found themselves vulnerable in ways they had never anticipated. The killer was someone they knew, someone they trusted, someone who had shared meals with them and laughed at their jokes. Each elimination required Kuznetsov to perform an extraordinary psychological feat. He would spend days or weeks building genuine personal relationships with his targets, learning about their families, their fears, their aspirations. These men were not abstract enemies, but real human beings whose lives he came to know intimately. Yet when the moment came for action, he could suppress any emotional connection completely, becoming as cold and efficient as any professional assassin. The psychological techniques he used to manage this internal contradiction reveal something profound about human adaptability under extreme circumstances. Kuznetsov appeared to compartmentalize his consciousness so thoroughly that Paul Sebert could genuinely like someone that Nikolai Kuznetsov was planning to eliminate. The German officer persona developed its own emotional responses, separate from the Soviet agent's strategic calculations. One operation involved befriending a German judge who had been particularly harsh in prosecuting resistance activities. Over several months, Kuznetsov cultivated a relationship that evolved into something resembling genuine friendship. The judge invited him to family dinners, introduced him to his wife and children, shared his concerns about the war's progress. Yet throughout this period, Kuznetsov was methodically planning the man's death, studying his security arrangements, and waiting for the optimal moment to strike. When the elimination occurred, it was carried out with such precision that German investigators initially suspected internal German politics rather than enemy action. The judge died in circumstances that appeared accidental, with no evidence linking his death to any known resistance group. Paul Sebert attended the funeral, expressing appropriate grief and offering condolences to the widow whose husband he had killed. The complete absence of any emotional disturbance in his behavior convinced German colleagues that he was exactly who he claimed to be. These operations had effects far beyond the removal of individual targets. German officials throughout the region began to exhibit signs of severe psychological stress. They became suspicious of colleagues, avoided social gatherings, and implemented security measures that interfered with their official duties. The mere possibility that the killer might be someone within their own ranks created a climate of paranoia that degraded the effectiveness of the entire occupation administration. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of these operations was how they affected Kuznetsov himself. Rather than showing signs of psychological strain from living such a profound double life, he seemed to gain energy from the challenge. His handlers began to worry that he was becoming addicted to the thrill of deception, that Paul Sebert was becoming more real to him than Nikolai Kuznetsov. Living as Paul Sebert required Kuznetsov to maintain multiple layers of deception simultaneously, creating a psychological complexity that few human beings have ever experienced. He was not simply pretending to be German. He was inhabiting the identity so completely that his German persona developed its own memories, preferences, and emotional responses. This profound level of character immersion created psychological dynamics that challenged every assumption about human identity and consciousness. The most unsettling aspect was how naturally Paul Sebert's personality began to emerge. During his training, Kuznetsov had consciously constructed the German officer's character traits, but after months of living the role, Sebert began developing characteristics that surprised even Kuznetsov himself. The persona acquired a taste for certain foods, preferences for specific types of music, and opinions about art and literature that Kuznetsov had never consciously decided upon. It was as if Paul Sebert was becoming an autonomous personality sharing the same body. This psychological fragmentation created practical challenges that went far beyond the operational difficulties of maintaining a cover story. Kuznetsov found himself in situations where his emotional responses as Paul Sebert conflicted with his analytical assessments as a Soviet agent. When German colleagues shared news of military defeats, Sebert felt genuine concern for their welfare, while Kuznetsov simultaneously celebrated Soviet victories. These competing emotional reactions created internal tensions that required extraordinary mental discipline to manage. The isolation was perhaps the most psychologically demanding aspect of the entire operation. Kuznetsov could never fully relax, never completely trust anyone, never express his authentic thoughts or feelings about any subject. Every conversation was a performance. Every relationship was calculated. Every emotion had to be evaluated for its operational utility. The constant need for vigilance created a state of hyper-alertness that would have been unsustainable for most people over extended periods. Sleep became particularly problematic. Dreams were the one realm where conscious control weakened, where suppressed thoughts and emotions might surface. Kuznetsov had to remain alert even while unconscious, monitoring his sleep-talking, or any other unconscious behaviors that might reveal his true identity. He developed techniques for controlling his dream content, essentially learning to spy on his own subconscious mind. Perhaps most remarkably, Kuznetsov seemed to adapt to these extraordinary psychological demands without showing obvious signs of mental strain. His reports to handlers remained clear and analytical. His operational performance continued improving, and observers noted no deterioration in his judgment or effectiveness. But this apparent psychological resilience raised disturbing questions about what kind of person could function so effectively under such extreme conditions. Some intelligence specialists who studied his case files decades later suggested that Kuznetsov might have possessed what psychologists now recognize as an unusually flexible sense of personal identity. Rather than having a fixed personality that would be damaged by prolonged role-playing, he may have had a naturally fluid sense of self that allowed him to genuinely become different people without losing his core functionality. Others proposed a darker interpretation, that Kuznetsov had been psychologically damaged by his experiences, but the damage manifested as enhanced operational capability rather than obvious dysfunction. Perhaps the man who returned from his missions was neither Nikolai Kuznetsov nor Paul Sebert, but something new created by the fusion of multiple identities under extreme stress. By early 1944, the strategic situation in Ukraine was shifting dramatically. Soviet forces were advancing westward, German defensive positions were crumbling, and the entire structure of Nazi occupation was beginning to collapse. For someone in Kuznetsov's position, these developments created both opportunities and unprecedented dangers. As German forces retreated, the social networks that had protected his cover began fragmenting, while the approaching Soviet army created new risks of exposure. His final mission carried symbolic weight that everyone involved understood, though no one discussed openly. The target was Erich Koch, the brutal Reichskommissar of Ukraine, whose policies had resulted in the deaths of millions of Ukrainian civilians. Eliminating Koch would represent both a strategic victory and a form of justice for the enormous suffering he had caused. But the operation also represented a level of risk that exceeded anything Kuznetsov had previously attempted. Koch's security arrangements reflected both his importance and his awareness of the threats against him. He traveled with armed escorts, varied his routes unpredictably, and maintained residences in multiple locations. Getting close enough to eliminate him would require exceptional planning and probably involve sacrificing the Paul Sebert identity that had been so carefully constructed and maintained. The psychological challenge was equally daunting. After more than a year of living as Paul Sebert, Kuznetsov had grown attached to the identity in ways that complicated his willingness to sacrifice it. Sebert had developed genuine friendships, professional relationships, and a social position that provided satisfactions Kuznetsov had never experienced as himself. Destroying this identity would be like committing a form of suicide. On March 9th, 1944, everything went wrong simultaneously. The exact details remain classified in Russian intelligence archives, but the general outline is clear. Kuznetsov and two companions were traveling through a forest near the village of Borodin when they encountered a Ukrainian nationalist patrol. The meeting should have been routine. Paul Sebert's credentials were impeccable, and he had talked his way through dozens of similar encounters. But something in the exchange triggered suspicion. Perhaps Kuznetsov's extended time living as a German had subtly altered his Ukrainian pronunciation. Perhaps the nationalist fighters had received information about Soviet agents operating in the region. Or perhaps, after so many months of living on the edge of discovery, his extraordinary luck had simply run out. The firefight that followed was brief and decisive. When it ended, Nikolai Kuznetsov was dead at age 32, along with his companions. His body was found wearing the uniform of a German officer, carrying the papers of Paul Wilhelm Sebert. But somehow, in his final moments, he had reverted to his true identity. Witnesses reported that his last words were spoken in Russian, not German. Perhaps the first time in over a year that his authentic voice had been heard. The full scope of Kuznetsov's achievements remained hidden for decades after his death. Soviet authorities were reluctant to reveal details about intelligence operations that might compromise future activities or expose sensitive sources and methods. Even his family was told only that he had died heroically serving the Soviet Union, with no details about his specific mission or extraordinary accomplishments. It was not until 1990 that Kuznetsov was officially recognized as a NKVD agent. This delayed acknowledgement meant that for 46 years after his death, the true nature of his service remained shrouded in official secrecy. During this period, his story was told in deliberately vague terms that emphasized his patriotism and sacrifice, while omitting the remarkable specifics of his intelligence work. When official recognition finally came, it revealed accomplishments that stunned even veteran intelligence professionals. In the 16 months of work, Kuznetsov assassinated 11 Nazi generals and high-ranking officials in occupied Ukraine. Beyond these direct actions, his intelligence gathering had provided information that influenced major military operations and saved countless Soviet lives through early warning of German plans and capabilities. The psychological aspects of his service proved equally significant for intelligence training and operational planning. Kuznetsov had demonstrated that human identity was far more malleable than previously understood, that properly prepared individuals could maintain deep cover roles for extended periods without obvious psychological deterioration. His case became a subject of intensive study within intelligence services worldwide, influencing training methods and operational doctrines that remain classified today. Popular recognition came gradually through books, films, and memorials that portrayed him as a model of Soviet heroism. But these public presentations necessarily simplified the complex psychological and moral dimensions of his story. The man who could befriend his targets before killing them, who could live convincingly as his nation's enemy while serving his homeland, represented moral complexities that did not fit easily into traditional heroic narratives. Veterans of intelligence services who studied his case files reached different conclusions about his legacy. Some viewed him as the ideal intelligence operative, someone who had achieved perfect operational effectiveness through complete dedication to his mission. Others saw him as a cautionary example of what could happen when operational demands pushed human psychology beyond sustainable limits. His grave in Lviv became a pilgrimage site for intelligence professionals and patriotic citizens alike. But perhaps the most fitting memorial was the continuing classified study of his methods and psychology within intelligence training facilities. Generations of future agents would study his techniques while grappling with questions about the psychological costs of living lives of complete deception. Historical controversies surrounding Kuznetsov's story reflect both the secrecy that protected intelligence operations and the natural human tendency to mythologize extraordinary individuals. His file is still not fully disclosed and will be held until 2025 in the FSB archives. This continuing classification has created space for speculation, embellishment, and competing interpretations of his accomplishments and methods. Some historians question whether the number of eliminations attributed to him is accurate, suggesting that Soviet propaganda may have inflated his achievements for morale purposes. They argue that conducting 11 successful operations against high-value targets within 16 months would represent an almost impossible operational tempo, requiring resources and support networks that may not have been available in occupied Ukraine. Others challenge the psychological portrait of Kuznetsov as someone who seamlessly inhabited multiple identities. They suggest that the absence of documented psychological problems may reflect inadequate record-keeping rather than genuine mental stability. Modern psychologists who have studied his case files express skepticism that anyone could maintain such profound identity deception without suffering measurable psychological damage. The circumstances of his death remain particularly controversial. Official accounts describe a chance encounter with Ukrainian nationalist forces, but some researchers suggest alternative explanations. One theory proposes that he was deliberately betrayed by someone within Soviet intelligence who viewed his growing psychological independence as a threat. Another suggests that he may have been identified through German counterintelligence operations that were more sophisticated than previously acknowledged. More fundamental questions concern the moral implications of his methods. While his strategic accomplishments are undeniable, some critics argue that his techniques, befriending targets before killing them, exploiting personal relationships for operational purposes, represented a form of psychological warfare that violated basic principles of human dignity. These critics suggest that celebrating such methods, regardless of their effectiveness, normalizes deception and manipulation in ways that damage social trust. Supporters counter that such moral concerns are inappropriate when applied to wartime intelligence operations against an enemy that had committed unprecedented atrocities. They argue that Kuznetsov's methods, however psychologically complex, were justified by both the strategic necessity of defeating Nazi Germany and the moral imperative of stopping the Holocaust and other war crimes. The debate reflects broader questions about the ethics of intelligence work and the psychological costs of serving in roles that require sustained deception. Kuznetsov's case remains relevant for contemporary discussions about the limits of acceptable operational methods and the responsibility of nations to protect the psychological welfare of intelligence operatives. Kuznetsov's operational methods revolutionized understanding of deep-cover intelligence work and influenced training programs in intelligence services worldwide. His demonstration that a properly prepared operative could maintain an alternative identity for extended periods under extreme stress challenged existing assumptions about the limits of human psychological adaptability and operational capability. Intelligence training facilities began incorporating elements of his identity immersion techniques into their curricula, though with modifications designed to prevent the complete psychological transformation that characterized his operations. Modern deep-cover training emphasizes maintaining connection to authentic identity while developing operational personas, seeking to achieve operational effectiveness without risking psychological fragmentation. The cultural impact extended far beyond intelligence circles. His story became a template for spy fiction that emphasized psychological complexity over technological gadgetry. Authors and filmmakers drew inspiration from the moral ambiguities of his situation, creating characters who struggled with similar conflicts between authentic identity and operational requirements. Soviet cinema produced multiple films based on his exploits, though these presentations typically simplified the psychological dimensions while emphasizing patriotic themes. The film adaptations portrayed him as a heroic figure whose dedication to homeland justified any operational methods, avoiding the moral complexities that made his real story so psychologically compelling. Academic study of his case contributed to development of psychological theories about identity formation and maintenance under extreme stress. Researchers studying personality disorders, dissociative conditions, and trauma responses found his case relevant to understanding how consciousness adapts to extraordinary circumstances. Modern intelligence services continue studying his methods while grappling with ethical questions his case raises. The effectiveness of his operations is undeniable, but the psychological costs remain difficult to assess. Intelligence professionals debate whether such methods should be taught, encouraged, or prohibited based on concerns about long-term effects on operative welfare and broader social implications. His influence extends to contemporary discussions about online identity and digital deception. In an era where people routinely maintain multiple online personas, his example of complete identity immersion offers both inspiration and warning about the psychological risks of living fragmented digital lives. The network of intelligence operatives working in occupied Europe during World War II included several individuals whose stories parallel Kuznetsov's in remarkable ways. These parallel cases illuminate both the exceptional nature of his achievements and the broader context of Soviet intelligence operations during the period. Another deep-cover operative working simultaneously in occupied Poland had developed similar techniques for identity immersion, though with less dramatic operational results. This agent, whose identity remains classified, spent 2 years posing as a Polish businessman while gathering intelligence about German industrial capabilities. Unlike Kuznetsov, however, this operative suffered severe psychological problems after returning from his mission, requiring extensive rehabilitation and never returning to active intelligence work. Fragmentary records suggest that Soviet intelligence attempted to replicate Kuznetsov's methods with other operatives during the war, with mixed results. Several agents received similar identity immersion training, but most proved unable to maintain their cover personas under operational stress. These failures highlighted how exceptional Kuznetsov's psychological capabilities actually were, making his achievements even more remarkable in retrospect. One curious detail that emerged from partially declassified files involves Kuznetsov's relationship with German prisoner of war camps, where he studied Wehrmacht culture and language patterns. In the winter of 1942, Kuznetsov was transferred to a camp for German prisoners of war in Krasnogorsk. There he studied the life of the Wehrmacht and then underwent parachute training. Former prisoners later reported encounters with a Russian interrogator whose German was so perfect they assumed he was an ethnic German working for Soviet intelligence. Personal artifacts recovered after his death included items that revealed the psychological complexity of maintaining multiple identities. He carried photographs and personal letters that appeared to document Paul Sebert's fictional family relationships, suggesting that he had created an entire imaginary personal history, complete with emotional attachments to people who never existed. Intelligence historians have identified several operations attributed to other agents that may actually have been conducted by Kuznetsov under different identities. The evidence suggests he may have used multiple German personas simultaneously, creating an intelligence network where he was essentially running operations against himself to maintain operational security. The Ukrainian nationalist forces responsible for his death later claimed they had identified him through intelligence provided by German counter-espionage services. If accurate, this would mean that German authorities had become aware of Soviet deep-cover operations, but chose to use nationalist forces rather than their own personnel to eliminate the threat, possibly to avoid revealing their own counterintelligence capabilities. Recent archaeological investigations near the site of his death have uncovered evidence suggesting the firefight was more extensive than originally reported. Shell casings and other artifacts indicate a prolonged engagement involving significantly more personnel than mentioned in official accounts, raising questions about whether his final mission was more complex than previously understood. These connected stories and hidden details continue emerging as archives are gradually declassified and researchers gain access to previously restricted materials. Each new revelation adds complexity to an already remarkable story, ensuring that Kuznetsov's legacy will continue evolving as our understanding of his extraordinary life and service deepens. The 16 months of Paul Sebert's existence were punctuated by moments when the entire operation balanced on the edge of catastrophe. Each close call revealed both the extraordinary risks of deep-cover work and Kuznetsov's remarkable ability to think quickly under pressure when the margin for error had completely disappeared. The most dangerous encounter occurred in December 1943, when Kuznetsov found himself seated across from two Romanian officers who claimed to know the real Sebert family. They had arrived unexpectedly at a social gathering, introducing themselves as old friends of Paul's father from Bucharest. The coincidence seemed impossibly unlucky, until Kuznetsov realized this was exactly the kind of verification test German counterintelligence might arrange. The conversation that followed required split-second decision-making that could have exposed him instantly. When the Romanians began sharing specific memories about Paul's childhood, Kuznetsov had to decide whether to admit ignorance, risk invention, or find another way through the trap. He chose a third option, claiming recent head trauma from a traffic accident had affected his memory of earlier years. This explanation allowed him to ask questions rather than provide answers, turning the interrogation into a conversation where the Romanians themselves supplied details about the fictional Paul's background. The psychological pressure during this exchange was enormous. Kuznetsov later described feeling as if time had slowed down, his mind racing through possibilities while maintaining the calm exterior of a German officer casually catching up with old acquaintances. Every response had to be measured not only for factual accuracy, but for emotional authenticity. Too much enthusiasm might seem suspicious. Too little might appear rude or strange. Another critical moment came during a medical examination required for all foreign officers serving in German units. The examining physician was thorough and observant, noting small discrepancies that could have indicated false identity. Soviet dental work was different from German procedures. Childhood diseases left different scars. Even vaccination patterns varied between countries. Kuznetsov had prepared for such scrutiny, but preparation could not account for every detail a trained medical professional might notice. During the examination, the doctor commented on an unusual scar pattern that seemed inconsistent with Sebert's claimed medical history. Without hesitation, Kuznetsov spun an elaborate story about a childhood accident involving farm equipment, providing specific details that made the explanation convincing. But he noticed the doctor making notes and realized this information would likely be verified through other channels. The most psychologically challenging close call involved a chance meeting with a genuine German officer who had served in Romania and knew the region where Paul Sebert supposedly grew up. This officer began testing Kuznetsov's knowledge with increasingly specific questions about local geography, climate, and customs. Unlike the Romanian encounter, this conversation could not be deflected through claims of memory problems. Kuznetsov survived this interrogation through a combination of careful preparation and intuitive psychology. His training had included detailed study of Romanian geography and German communities there, but more importantly, he understood how to guide conversations toward topics where he had knowledge while avoiding areas where he was vulnerable. He accomplished this by asking the officer about his own experiences, expressing fascination with stories that prompted the man to talk about himself rather than test Paul's background. Each successful navigation of these potential disasters built Kuznetsov's confidence while simultaneously increasing the psychological strain of maintaining constant vigilance. The knowledge that any conversation could become a life-or-death test created a state of hyper-alertness that few people could sustain for extended periods. Yet rather than showing signs of fatigue, Kuznetsov seemed to gain energy from these challenges, as if the constant danger provided the stimulation he needed to maintain his extraordinary performance. The transformation of Nikolai Kuznetsov from classified intelligence operative to Soviet cultural hero created inevitable distortions between historical reality and public memory. Propaganda requirements, artistic license, and the natural human tendency to mythologize extraordinary individuals combined to create a public image that, while inspiring, often departed significantly from documented facts. Soviet films about Kuznetsov, beginning with productions in the 1960s, established many of the dramatic elements that continue influencing popular understanding of his story. These films emphasized heroic moments while simplifying the psychological complexity that made his operations possible. The real Kuznetsov's ability to genuinely befriend his targets before eliminating them created moral ambiguities that did not fit easily into straightforward heroic narratives. Cinematic portrayals typically showed Kuznetsov maintaining clear emotional distance from his German persona, treating the Paul Sebert identity as merely a professional tool rather than the complex psychological reality it became. Films avoided exploring the deeper implications of living such a profound double life, focusing instead on action sequences and patriotic themes that supported broader propaganda objectives. The number of operations attributed to Kuznetsov also became subject to embellishment over time. While 11 confirmed eliminations represented an extraordinary achievement for any intelligence operative, popular accounts began including additional operations that could not be verified through documentation. These additions enhanced the dramatic impact of his story, but created confusion about the scope of his actual accomplishments. Western intelligence assessments of Kuznetsov's operations, conducted during the Cold War, often reached different conclusions than Soviet accounts. American and British analysts, working with limited information but applying different analytical frameworks, sometimes questioned the strategic significance of his achievements, or suggested that Soviet sources had exaggerated their importance for propaganda purposes. These Western critiques reflected broader skepticism about Soviet claims during the Cold War period, but they also raised legitimate questions about the difficulty of verifying intelligence operations that were designed to remain secret. The most successful deception operations leave minimal documentary evidence, making historical assessment particularly challenging decades after the fact. Academic historians studying Kuznetsov's case have identified several areas where popular accounts diverge from available evidence. The psychological portrayal of his identity management, the specific techniques he used for maintaining his cover, and the extent of support he received from other Soviet operatives all became subjects of scholarly debate that continues today. Perhaps most significantly, the mythological version of Kuznetsov's story often minimized the psychological costs of his operations, presenting him as someone who could seamlessly move between identities without internal conflict or lasting trauma. This portrayal served propaganda purposes by suggesting that Soviet citizens possessed extraordinary capabilities when properly motivated, but it ignored the human complexity that made his achievements so remarkable. Modern Russian portrayals of Kuznetsov reflect contemporary political concerns as much as historical accuracy. Recent films and books about his life emphasize aspects of his story that support current narratives about Russian military capability and intelligence service effectiveness, sometimes departing from documented facts to enhance these themes. The challenge of separating myth from reality in Kuznetsov's case reflects broader problems in intelligence history, where the most important operations often remain classified long after they lose strategic significance. public understanding necessarily depends on sanitized versions that protect sources and methods, while satisfying popular interest in extraordinary stories. What remains consistent across all accounts, both mythologized and academic, is recognition that Kuznetsov achieved something unprecedented in intelligence history. Whether the specific details match popular understanding or not, his basic accomplishment of maintaining deep cover for extended periods while conducting successful operations against sophisticated enemies represents a remarkable human achievement that deserves recognition regardless of how it has been portrayed in popular culture.